To escape her violent ex, she kissed a stranger, unaware he was a vampire king who'd change her life. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started. Claire's life was far from ordinary. She had never imagined herself as the typical damsel in distress, but lately, she found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Claire had always prided herself on being independent. She worked hard as a waitress in a small downtown diner, barely making ends meet but never complaining. But that all changed the day she met James. James, her boyfriend, had started as a charming, protective figure in her life. But over time, he had become something else entirely, someone she was terrified of. The shouting matches had turned into physical confrontations, and the bruises on her arms became something she could no longer hide with long sleeves. No one knew what was really going on, and Claire couldn't bear to tell them. She didn't know how to escape. Every time she tried, he would apologize, buy her flowers, promise it would never happen again, but it always did. Now, she was at her breaking point. After yet another brutal argument, Claire had decided she couldn't live like this anymore. She had to leave. The problem was, she had nowhere to go. James had taken everything from her, her confidence, her safety, and her sense of control. Claire packed a small bag, grabbed what little money she had, and left in the dead of night, hoping to disappear without a trace. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she couldn't go back to him. The cold wind bit at her skin as she walked through the streets of the city. The bright lights from the tall buildings made her feel even smaller, like a speck in an endless ocean of people. She could barely keep her eyes open, exhaustion from the last few days catching up to her. She needed a place to rest, to think. That's when she saw him, a man standing under the glow of a street lamp, looking out of place. He had an aura of mystery, his dark eyes piercing through the dim night. His face was sharp, his features chiseled as if carved by an artist. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, Claire felt as if time had stopped. He smiled at her, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. The man spoke, his voice deep, smooth, and strangely comforting. "Are you lost?" he asked. Claire didn't know why, but she nodded. Something about him seemed different, like he understood the fear that had been haunting her for weeks. Without thinking, she took a step closer, and before she could stop herself, she kissed him. It was as if everything in her life had led up to that moment. The kiss was gentle, unexpected, and yet, it felt like a release. As soon as their lips met, she felt a surge of warmth flood her chest, like a dam breaking, and she pulled away in shock. The man stood still, his gaze intense, almost unreadable. Claire's heart raced, and she took a step back, confused by what had just happened. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. But the man's expression softened, and he reached out a hand to steady her. "You didn't just save yourself, Claire," he said, his voice low but filled with an undeniable power. Claire froze. How did he know her name? Was she dreaming? This stranger was not who she thought he was. And in that moment, she realized, she had just made a choice that would change her life forever. Claire stumbled backward, her heart racing as the man's words hung in the air. She had kissed him. She had just kissed a complete stranger in the middle of the street, and now, she was standing there, breathless and confused. He was standing perfectly still, his gaze never leaving her, a faint but enigmatic smile on his lips. She couldn't understand why she wasn't running away. She should have been terrified. After everything she had just escaped, after James and the terror he had put her through, this strange man should have sent her into a panic. But something in his presence calmed her, in a way that felt almost too familiar. "You're safe now," the man said, his voice smooth like velvet. The words lingered, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just meant for this moment. They were meant for something much deeper, something more intense than she could understand. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask. The man stepped closer, his eyes dark and focused, as though he was studying her every move. "I'm someone who can help you," he replied cryptically. "But you need to come with me." There's much you don't know. Claire hesitated, a part of her screaming to run in the opposite direction. But the other part, the part that felt tired and broken, couldn't ignore the pull she felt towards him. She had no idea who he was, but there was something about him that made her feel like he could offer her the safety and peace she so desperately needed. After a long pause, she nodded slowly, the uncertainty weighing heavily on her chest. "Okay," she said softly. The man offered her his arm, and for a moment, she almost thought she imagined it. But when she looked up into his eyes again, she saw something she couldn't explain, something old, powerful, and just a little bit dangerous. He wasn't just a man. He was something more, something she didn't understand. The man smiled again, that same faint smile, and began walking in the opposite direction, Claire following behind him. They didn't speak for a while, but Claire noticed the way the city seemed to shift as they walked. The streets, once bustling and bright, seemed quieter now, like the world was holding its breath. The man led her through alleyways and side streets, places she hadn't even noticed before. The deeper they went, the more Claire felt like she was walking into another world, a world that wasn't her own. They arrived at a large building, its exterior dark and imposing, but there was a sense of elegance about it, something grand about its structure that made Claire's heart race. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt like she was about to step into a story much bigger than her own. The man paused before the entrance, turning to face her. "This is where you'll be safe," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Claire stood there, staring up at the massive doors. She felt an overwhelming mix of fear and awe. Was she really going to step into this place? She thought of James, of the life she had just escaped, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the tiniest spark of hope. The man, sensing her hesitation, reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have nothing to fear," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I'll protect you." Claire nodded, a small part of her still uncertain but willing to trust him. She stepped forward, the heavy doors opening with a soft creak as they entered. The interior was nothing like Claire had ever seen before. The hall was vast, with high ceilings that seemed to stretch on forever, chandeliers hanging from above, their crystals glimmering in the low light. The atmosphere was thick with an ancient energy, and Claire could almost feel the history that soaked the walls. The man led her through the hall, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Claire noticed people staring, but they didn't look at her like they would look at a normal person. No, their eyes were filled with curiosity, and something else, something she couldn't quite place. They all seemed to know him. And then, as they reached the end of the hall, Claire saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. At the far end of the room, sitting on a raised platform, was a throne. And sitting in that throne was a man, another man, but this one was different. This man radiated power in a way that was almost unbearable to look at. His eyes were a brilliant shade of amber, glowing with an intensity that sent a shiver down Claire's spine. He was watching her, his gaze unwavering, and in that moment, Claire realized with a jolt that this man wasn't just any man. He was someone important. He was someone who could change everything. The stranger beside Claire, who had led her here, turned to face her. "This," he said, his voice quieter now, "is the Vampire King." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Vampire King? What was going on? And why had she kissed this stranger in the first place? But before she could ask another question, the Vampire King spoke, his voice low and commanding. "I've been waiting for you." Claire stood frozen in the grand hall, her heart pounding in her chest as the Vampire King's gaze locked onto hers. The weight of his stare felt like it was reaching deep inside her, as if he could see every part of her soul. His amber eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and for the first time since she had met the mysterious man who had brought her here, Claire felt an overwhelming sense of danger and power. The air around her felt charged, thick with an energy she couldn't explain. The man who had led her here, the one she had kissed only hours ago, stepped aside, his presence no longer as comforting as it had been. He looked at Claire, his expression unreadable. "This is the Vampire King," he repeated, his voice low, almost reverential. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Vampire King? She had no idea what that meant, but she could feel the weight of those words. The man sitting on the throne before her was more than just a powerful figure. He was someone who commanded an entire world she didn't understand. "You've brought her here," the Vampire King said, his voice smooth but cold, sending a shiver down Claire's spine. The tone was not harsh, but there was an edge to it, a sense of authority that left no room for disagreement. Why? The man beside Claire didn't answer right away. He looked at Claire, then back at the Vampire King, before speaking in a low voice. She's different, my lord. She has something unique. The Vampire King's gaze never left Claire. Unique? He echoed, his voice thoughtful. What do you mean? The words sent a ripple of fear through Claire. She had no idea what they were talking about. She was just a waitress, just a regular person. How could she be unique? She touched him. The man explained, his voice barely above a whisper. His heartbeat changed. His pulse became stronger when she touched him. Claire blinked, confused. What were they talking about? She had only touched the prince's wrist. She had no idea what it meant. The Vampire King stood from his throne, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. He crossed the distance between them with unsettling speed, and Claire instinctively took a step back. You. The Vampire King's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked down at her, his lips curling into a faint smile. You woke him. Claire's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaky. Who is he? The Vampire King's expression softened, but only slightly. He is my son, and for 50 years, he has not moved, not breathed. A curse binds him. But you. He paused, his gaze lingering on Claire. You are the first to break that curse. You have no idea what you've done, do you? Claire was trembling now, every instinct screaming for her to run, but she stood still, frozen by the enormity of the situation. The Vampire King's son was lying somewhere in this castle, his life frozen by a curse. And she had somehow, unwillingly, been the one to wake him. I didn't do anything, she whispered, trying to explain herself. I didn't mean to. The Vampire King stepped closer, and Claire could feel the heat radiating from his presence. It's not about what you meant to do, he said softly. It's about what you've unlocked. You are tied to this curse now, whether you realize it or not. The words hung heavy in the air, their meaning sinking in slowly. Claire had been trying to escape a life of fear and control, and now she had somehow stumbled into a much darker world, one that was both terrifying and filled with unimaginable power. She didn't know if she was ready for it. But I don't want this, she stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't ask for this. The Vampire King studied her, his expression unreadable. No one ever asks for the things that change their lives. But they happen anyway. He paused, his gaze never leaving her. And now, you are part of something much bigger than yourself. Claire felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, and she struggled to breathe. She wanted to leave, to run away, but something inside her, a strange pull she couldn't explain, kept her rooted to the spot. The Vampire King tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. You're scared, he said, almost as if it were a statement of fact. But fear will not protect you. He reached out a hand, and for a moment, Claire thought he might touch her. But instead, he stopped just short, his fingers hovering in the air. I can protect you, he said, his voice a low murmur. But only if you stay. Claire's mind was racing. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but somehow, despite the fear, she couldn't bring herself to say no. She had no choice but to stay, for now. The man who had brought her here, the Vampire King, and the curse that bound them all together were too powerful to escape. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King's lips curled into a slight smile. I want you to help my son, he said. And in return, I will help you. The offer hung in the air between them, an impossible choice she wasn't sure she was ready to make. But it was a choice she had to make. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. There was no turning back now. She nodded, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. I'll help, she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. The Vampire King gave a nod of approval. Good. You've made the right choice. Now we begin. The Vampire King's words echoed in Claire's mind, reverberating with a heavy sense of finality. He had given her an impossible choice, and now, she was bound to this strange world she couldn't understand. The weight of her decision pressed down on her shoulders, but Claire tried to ignore it. She had no choice but to stay, at least for now. The Vampire King turned his attention back to his son, who was lying motionless in the room. His skin, still pale as marble, seemed to shimmer under the low, flickering light of the candles that surrounded the bed. Claire approached the bedside slowly, her heart pounding as she looked at the prince, his once lifeless form now showing signs of life. The curse had begun to break, but it wasn't enough. The vampire king watched her closely, his amber eyes never leaving her. "You've done something no one else has been able to do," he said, his voice soft yet full of an ancient power. Claire looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean? I don't even know what I did." The vampire king stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, but his voice remained calm. "You're connected to him now. In a way, you're part of the cure. You may not understand it, but you will. You just need time." Claire swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the prince's wrist again. This time, there was no shock, no overwhelming surge of energy. But the prince's pulse was stronger, more stable than before. A soft breath escaped his lips, and for a moment, Claire thought she had imagined it. But when she looked at the vampire king, she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, something he hadn't shown before. "This is real," the vampire king whispered, almost to himself. "He's waking up." Claire didn't know how to feel. A part of her wanted to run, to escape this dark, strange world and never look back. But another part of her, the part that had been terrified and lost for so long, felt something she hadn't expected: connection. She had no idea how it had happened, but she couldn't deny that something was pulling her toward the prince, toward the world that had suddenly become her reality. The vampire king took a step back, his eyes still fixed on the scene in front of him. "I don't know how much longer he will stay unconscious," he said, his voice steady. "But he needs you. I can feel it. His magic is tied to yours now. You're the key." Claire's stomach twisted at the thought. She was the key to breaking a centuries-old curse? She wasn't equipped for this. She was just a girl who had fled from a toxic relationship, looking for a way out. She didn't belong in this world, not among vampires, curses, and magic. But she couldn't ignore the pull she felt. "What am I supposed to do?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. The vampire king studied her for a moment, as though deciding how much to reveal. "Stay by his side. Help him find his strength. The more you stay connected to him, the stronger he will become." Claire looked at the prince again. His once frozen body now seemed more alive, his chest rising and falling with steady, shallow breaths. There was hope, but it was fragile, uncertain. She wasn't sure what she had gotten herself into, but somehow, she couldn't leave. "And what happens after?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with fear. The vampire king's lips curled into a faint smile. "After, we wait." Claire didn't know if she believed him, but she nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze settle on her. "We wait for him to wake up fully," he continued. "And when he does, everything will change." Claire turned back to the prince, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. She had crossed into a world she never imagined, and the vampire king had made it clear that her place in it was more important than she could ever have imagined. She was the key to something ancient, something powerful, and something dangerous. The weight of that realization settled in her chest like a stone. "I don't know what's going to happen," Claire said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "But I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes." The vampire king's smile grew, but it wasn't comforting. It was knowing, as if he had seen this moment 1,000 times before. "Good," he said. "We'll see what you're made of, Claire. You've just begun." The air in the room seemed to shift as the prince's chest rose with a deeper breath, his fingers twitching slightly against the sheets. The curse was breaking, but Claire knew that this was only the beginning. She was no longer just a girl running away from her past. She was part of something far bigger and far more dangerous. And as much as she wanted to run, she couldn't. This was her reality now. The next few days passed in a blur, and Claire found herself caught in a whirlwind she didn't know how to navigate. She stayed by the prince's side, as the vampire king had instructed, her mind a constant storm of questions and fears. She had been pulled into a world she didn't understand, and now she was expected to play a role she didn't know how to fulfill. Despite her fear, Claire couldn't ignore the strange connection she felt to the prince. Every time she touched his hand, there was a faint pulse of energy that ran through her, as if they were bound by something far greater than coincidence. His body was warmer now, his breathing more regular, but his eyes, Those eyes that had once been closed in eternal slumber remained shut. The vampire king watched over them, his presence always near, but he rarely spoke unless necessary. He would stand in the corner of the room, his gaze unwavering as he observed the progress Claire was making with his son. "He's getting stronger," the vampire king would say in his quiet, measured voice. But there was something in his eyes that told Claire this was far from over. The curse was still hanging over them, a weight that none of them could escape. One night, as Claire sat by the prince's bedside, she felt a strange pull deep within her chest. It wasn't fear, nor was it dread. It was something else, something almost familiar, like the tug of destiny. She had been running from her past for so long, but now, for the first time, she realized she wasn't just running away, she was running towards something. The realization made her heart race, but she couldn't explain why. The prince's fingers twitched, breaking Claire's train of thought. She stood quickly, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. She could feel it. The change was happening. The prince's eyes fluttered, and Claire leaned forward, her heart pounding. He wasn't just breathing anymore. He was waking up. The room seemed to hold its breath as she reached out, gently cupping his face in her hands. His eyes opened slowly, the faintest trace of confusion in them. For a moment, there was silence. And then he spoke. "Where am I?" His voice was soft, rough from disuse, but there was something in it that made Claire's heart leap. It was the first time he had spoken in 50 years. The vampire king stepped forward, his presence commanding as ever. "You're awake, son," he said, his voice filled with a strange mixture of relief and something darker, something Claire couldn't place. The prince's gaze shifted from Claire to the vampire king, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Father." The word was tentative, like he wasn't sure if he should say it. The vampire king nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, my son. It's me." The prince slowly sat up, his body still weak, but his eyes sharper now, as if he was seeing the world for the first time in centuries. Claire stepped back, allowing father and son a moment to reconnect, but her mind was racing. She had done it. She had helped wake him up. But what did that mean? What role did she play in this strange, dangerous world she had stumbled into? The prince looked at her, his gaze piercing and intense. You helped me?" His voice was barely above a whisper, and Claire could see the weight of 50 years of silence in his eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was still hammering in her chest. "I did." He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to piece everything together. Then, his lips parted, and he said, "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Claire's heart flutter in her chest. He was awake, and she had played a part in it. But the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. What now? What was going to happen to her? She had no answers, only a strange feeling that the path ahead would be far more complicated than anything she could have imagined. The vampire king turned to her, his eyes softening ever so slightly. "You've done well, Claire," he said, his voice calm but filled with a weight of meaning. "But this is only the beginning. The curse is not fully broken. There are still things we must face." Claire nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. She had no idea what they were up against, but something told her that the challenges ahead would be unlike anything she had ever experienced. The prince, still weak but now alert, looked up at his father, then back at Claire. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. The vampire king's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Claire saw a flicker of something dangerous in them. "Now, we prepare for what's to come," he said, his tone grave. "There are enemies who will stop at nothing to ensure the curse remains in place. We must be ready." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had thought her life had been hard before, but now, she realized that it had only just begun. This was no longer just about escaping her past. This was about surviving a world she had never known existed, a world filled with danger, magic, and creatures far older and more powerful than she could have ever imagined. But as she looked at the prince, whose eyes were now filled with purpose and a newfound strength, she knew that there was no turning back. She had made her choice, and whatever came next, she would face it head on. Days turned into weeks, and Claire found herself settling into a routine she had never imagined. The vampire king, who had once seemed like a figure of untouchable power, was now a constant presence in her life. His son, Prince Kale, was slowly regaining his strength, but there was something else, a tension in the air that never seemed to dissipate. Claire could feel it in the way the Vampire King watched over everything, his gaze always sharp, always calculating. He never spoke much about the curse that had bound his son for 50 years, but it was clear that they were preparing for something. Every day, there were whispers in the halls, secret meetings with shadowy figures, and strange symbols drawn on ancient scrolls that Claire didn't understand. But the one thing that stood out to her the most was the increasing bond between her and Prince Kael. The more time they spent together, the more she felt drawn to him. His recovery had been slow, but every day, he looked stronger. His once pale skin had started to show a healthy flush, and his eyes, which had been dull and lifeless, now sparkled with intelligence. There was a fire in him, one that Claire had seen the first time she touched his hand. And with that fire came a growing connection, a pull that she couldn't ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire found herself in the prince's chamber, sitting by his bedside once again. He was awake, his eyes focused on a book in his hands. It had been weeks since he had truly spoken to her, but tonight, something felt different. As she watched him, the prince set the book down and turned toward her. His gaze softened for the first time in a long while. "You've been by my side all this time," he said quietly, his voice warm but still tinged with the weight of his past. "Why?" Claire hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She had no idea what had drawn her to him, no idea why she couldn't leave despite the danger and the secrets that surrounded her. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I couldn't leave you. Not after everything." Prince Kael's eyes searched hers, as if trying to read her very soul. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Claire felt her heart race in her chest. The prince's expression softened, and for the first time, Claire saw vulnerability in his eyes. "I never asked for this curse," he said, his voice low, as if the words were heavy with years of regret. "But you saved me. I don't know why, but I'm grateful." Claire's heart ached as she looked at him. She didn't know how she had saved him. She had only touched him. But somehow, that simple act had broken the curse that had held him captive for so long. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice shaky. "I just wanted to help." The prince reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a ripple of warmth through her. His fingers were strong but tender, and Claire could feel the weight of the moment, the connection between them growing stronger with every passing second. "You don't understand," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "You've changed everything. I may not know what that means yet, but I will." Claire swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had no idea what the prince was talking about, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her feel like she was a part of something much bigger than herself, something that was far beyond her control. As the night wore on, the Vampire King entered the room, his presence immediately filling the space. His amber eyes scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Claire and his son for a moment longer than usual. "It's time," he said, his voice commanding but not unkind. Claire looked at him, confused. "Time for what?" The Vampire King's gaze shifted to Prince Kael, and Claire could see the unspoken understanding between them. "The curse is broken, yes," the Vampire King said. "But there are others who seek to control what we've just unleashed." Claire's stomach tightened with unease. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. The Vampire King's expression grew dark. "The curse that bound my son was no ordinary spell. It was ancient magic, and those who cast it are not pleased with what has happened. They will come for us." Claire's blood ran cold at the thought of enemies who had the power to undo everything they had fought for. But before she could respond, Prince Kael stood, his face a mask of determination. "I'm not afraid," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever comes, we'll face it. Together." Claire nodded, feeling a surge of resolve rise within her. She had no idea what they were up against, but for the first time, she felt ready to fight for what was right. She had found something here, something worth protecting. The Vampire King turned toward the door, his posture rigid, but there was a flicker of something softer in his gaze. "Prepare yourselves," he said, his tone low but resolute. "The storm is coming." And just like that, Claire knew they were no longer just running from the past. They were about to face something far darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But with the Vampire King and Prince Kael by her side, Claire knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't face it alone. The atmosphere in the castle grew tense as the days passed. Claire could feel it in the air, an unease that settled over everything. The Vampire King had spoken of enemies coming for them, and she could sense that the calm she had enjoyed was temporary. Every moment seemed to hang in the balance, and the weight of what was to come pressed heavily on her shoulders. Despite her fears, Claire remained by Prince Kael's side, her heart torn between the terrifying unknown and the strange connection she felt to him. She couldn't explain why she was still here, why she hadn't left. There was something about him, something that felt destined, as if their paths had been intertwined long before they ever met. The prince had been recovering steadily, his strength returning with each passing day. But there was still a vulnerability in his eyes, a trace of the man who had been trapped in a curse for 50 long years. Claire watched him closely, noticing the way his gaze would occasionally drift toward the window, as if searching for something he couldn't find. "Are you all right?" she asked one evening, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He turned to her, his amber eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. "I don't know," he replied quietly. "I feel like I've woken up, but the world around me is still asleep." Claire didn't know what to say. She had never been in a situation like this, and the idea of facing ancient magic and enemies who sought to control them was overwhelming. "I'm here," she said softly. "You're not alone." He nodded, a small but meaningful gesture. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to say something else, but instead, he turned away, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Claire could sense the internal struggle he was facing. He was trying to adjust to a world he no longer recognized, to a life that had been stolen from him. But Claire was learning that no matter how much they tried to prepare, the future was always uncertain. That night, the Vampire King called for them. He stood in the grand hall, his presence as imposing as ever. His amber eyes flashed with a fierce determination as he addressed them. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low but firm. "The enemies I spoke of have been gathering strength for years. They know that Kael's curse has been broken, and they won't stop until they've regained control over him." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. She wasn't just a bystander in this battle. She was now part of it. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The Vampire King's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, she saw something soft in his eyes. "We fight," he said simply, "but we can't do it alone." He turned to Prince Kael, who had been standing silently by Claire's side. "You are no longer the boy you once were," the Vampire King continued. "You are the heir to the throne, and it is time to reclaim your birthright." Kael's expression darkened, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I never wanted the throne," he said quietly, "but I can't hide from what I am. I'm not the same person I was 50 years ago. I won't be anyone's puppet again." The Vampire King nodded. "That's the spirit I need from you. We will not allow our enemies to control us any longer." Claire watched the exchange between father and son, feeling the weight of the moment. They were preparing for a battle, one that would decide the future of their world. "Where do we start?" she asked. The Vampire King's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "We start by finding them before they find us." The plan was set. Over the next few days, Claire, Prince Kael, and the Vampire King began gathering their forces. They made contact with old allies, reaching out to those who still stood loyal to the Vampire King's rule. But every move they made was watched. It was clear that their enemies were closing in. As the days passed, the tension in the castle reached a boiling point. One evening, just as Claire was about to retire to her room, a loud bang echoed through the hallways. She rushed toward the source of the noise, her heart pounding in her chest. When she arrived, she saw Prince Kael standing in the middle of the room, his eyes blazing with fury. The Vampire King stood beside him, his posture rigid, but there was no mistaking the worry in his eyes. "They've found us," the Vampire King said quietly. "It's time." Claire's stomach twisted with fear as she realized that the battle they had been preparing for was finally here. There was no more time for hesitation. It was do or die. She stepped forward, her gaze meeting Prince Kael's. "I'm with you," she said firmly. "No matter what happens, we face it together." The prince's lips curled into a small smile, but there was a flicker of something else, something deeper, in his eyes. "Together," he repeated. The battle had begun, and Claire knew that there was no turning back. They had come this far, and they would fight to the end, no matter the cost. The castle was silent that night, but beneath the surface, the air buzzed with tension. Claire had never seen the Vampire King look so focused, so determined. He moved through the halls like a storm ready to strike, and even Prince Kael, usually so reserved, seemed to radiate a quiet urgency. They had only moments before their enemies descended upon them, and every second counted. Claire stood at the entrance of the war room, her heart pounding as she watched the men prepare. The Vampire King was speaking in low, controlled tones to his advisors, discussing the strategies they would employ to hold off their attackers. Meanwhile, Kael stood by the window, his eyes scanning the night, his posture tense. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far darker than they anticipated. The enemy wasn't just a group of rogue vampires. They were a faction with centuries of knowledge and dark magic, and they wanted nothing less than total control. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Claire asked, her voice hesitant as she approached Kael. He turned, his amber eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "We don't have a choice," he said softly. "The world we're fighting for isn't just mine anymore. It's ours." Claire nodded, her heart swelling with something she couldn't explain. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of this fight, whether she was ready for it or not. The prince walked toward the door, his steps steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "Stay close," he added, his voice low but firm. "The battle won't be easy. We'll need to rely on each other." Claire's breath caught in her throat as she followed him through the castle's winding corridors. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the stone halls, signaling the final preparations. It was almost time. They emerged into the courtyard, where the night sky stretched above them, dark and heavy with the promise of an impending storm. Soldiers lined up, their eyes steely with resolve as they prepared for battle. Claire's stomach churned as she saw the look in their eyes. This was no ordinary conflict. It was a fight for survival, a battle that would determine the future of their world. As the Vampire King entered the courtyard, his presence demanded attention. His aura was suffocating, and the soldiers bowed their heads, their respect for him palpable. He wasn't just a king. He was a force of nature, a leader who had survived centuries of war and betrayal. And now, he was leading them into another war. This one more dangerous than any before. "Stay close," the Vampire King instructed Claire once more, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "When the time comes, you'll know what to do." Claire nodded, her throat dry with fear. What was expected of her in this battle? She had never been trained for this, never prepared for anything like it. But she had already made her choice. She was with them, for better or for worse. Suddenly, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the courtyard. Claire's heart raced as she turned to see figures emerging from the shadows. They were coming. The enemy had arrived. The Vampire King stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his expression unreadable. "Prepare yourselves," he commanded. The soldiers snapped into action, moving into position as the first wave of enemies emerged from the darkness. They were vampires, but these were not like the ones Claire had come to know. These were older, stronger, and much more dangerous. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural hunger, and their movements were swift and precise. The Vampire King didn't hesitate. He was the first to charge, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. His soldiers followed, moving with the same fluidity, striking down the enemies in their path. Claire stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. But as she watched the chaos unfold around her, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was part of this fight. She grabbed the sword at her side, her fingers trembling as she lifted it. She wasn't sure she could fight, but she couldn't stand by and do nothing either. As the enemy closed in, Claire moved with the others, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no training, no experience, but she could feel the fire inside her. She could feel the bond she shared with Kael, with the Vampire King, and with this world they had created. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their future. The battle raged on, the sound of clashing steel and screams filling the air. Claire's mind was spinning, but she kept moving, striking when she could, dodging when she couldn't. It wasn't graceful, but it was enough to keep her alive. She caught glimpses of Kael, his eyes fierce as he cut down enemy after enemy, and the Vampire King, his movements effortless as he commanded the battlefield. They were unstoppable together. But the enemy wasn't giving up. They kept coming, wave after wave, their numbers seemingly endless. Claire's arms were heavy, her breath ragged, but she didn't stop. Not when she saw Kale falter. Not when she saw the Vampire King take a blow. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone. She couldn't let them fall. The tide of the battle shifted in an instant. The Vampire King's sword glinted in the dim light as he struck down one of the enemy leaders. But it wasn't enough. The leader's death only seemed to fuel the remaining enemies, and Claire saw them closing in on Kale. Her heart stopped. Without thinking, she rushed toward him, sword in hand, her feet moving faster than she could process. She couldn't lose him, not after everything they had been through. She reached him just in time, swinging her sword with all the strength she had left. The enemy leader stumbled back, caught off guard by her unexpected attack. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood by Kale's side, the battle raging around them. She wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. No matter the cost, they would face this together. The battle raged on through the night, its intensity only growing as the enemy's forces showed no sign of relenting. Claire's body ached, exhaustion weighing down her every step, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't allow herself to. She had never imagined she would be here, fighting for survival beside a Vampire King and the prince who had once been bound by a curse. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. With every strike of her sword, with every enemy she faced, she could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. This wasn't just about breaking a curse anymore. This was about survival. The survival of everyone she had come to care for. She glanced to her side and caught a glimpse of Prince Kale, his eyes fierce as he fought, the sharpness of his movements reflecting his newfound strength. He was no longer the fragile prince lying in a coma for 50 years. He was becoming the leader he was born to be. And Claire, by his side, was becoming something more than she had ever imagined herself to be. The Vampire King was a force of nature on the battlefield. His presence alone was enough to make the enemies hesitate, but he was relentless, cutting through their ranks like a blade through paper. His power was unmatched, and Claire couldn't help but feel the awe that came with witnessing such strength. But even the Vampire King, as powerful as he was, had his limits. She saw him stagger for a brief moment, a flash of vulnerability crossing his face as a hidden enemy struck from the shadows. Claire's heart stopped. She couldn't let him fall. Not now. Not when everything they had fought for was at stake. Without thinking, she rushed toward him, sword raised high. She fought with everything she had left, her movements fueled by the sheer desperation to protect those she had come to love. The clash of steel against steel filled her ears as she joined the fight at the Vampire King's side. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and commanding, though his breath was labored from the fight. Claire nodded, her heart pounding as she stayed close to him. Together, they moved as one, their strikes perfectly synchronized, cutting through the remaining enemies with precision. They made their way toward the heart of the battle, where the enemy's leader awaited. The air was thick with tension as the leader of the enemy forces revealed himself, stepping out from the shadows with a sinister smile on his face. "You think you've won?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You're nothing compared to the power we possess." Claire's heart raced as she looked at the leader, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. This was it. This was the final challenge. But she wouldn't back down. "Not now. We will never bow to you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that swirled in her chest. The leader laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You have no idea what you're up against." He raised his hand, and with a flick of his wrist, the ground beneath their feet trembled. Claire's breath caught in her throat as dark magic erupted around them. The leader's power was unlike anything she had ever felt before, ancient and destructive. But she wouldn't let it consume them. She could feel the magic within her, the bond she shared with Prince Kale, and the strength she had discovered within herself. This wasn't just about power. It was about belief, about standing together and fighting for the future they wanted to create. The battle intensified as the leader unleashed more dark magic, but Claire refused to falter. With a cry, she charged forward, her sword glowing with the strength of her resolve. Prince Kale joined her, his eyes blazing with determination. Together, They struck. The vampire king was right behind them, his own sword cutting through the darkness. And in that moment, everything seemed to shift. The leader's power faltered, the darkness around them shrinking. No, the leader screamed, his voice filled with rage as he tried to regain control. But it was too late. With one final strike, Prince Kale's sword pierced through the enemy leader's heart, and the dark magic that had been choking the land faded away. The battlefield grew quiet, the sounds of battle silencing as the last of the enemy forces retreated. Claire stood there, breathless, her body shaking from the intensity of the fight. She couldn't believe it was over. They had won. But as she looked around at the aftermath, she knew this was just the beginning. The enemy had been defeated, but there were still many battles ahead. The Vampire King, Prince Kale, and Claire had fought together to overcome this threat, but their enemies were many, and their world was far from safe. The Vampire King turned to face them, his expression solemn but proud. "We've won," he said, his voice low. "But the war is far from over." Prince Kale stepped forward, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "We'll face whatever comes," he said firmly. Together, Claire felt a surge of pride, of belonging, as she stood by their side. She had found something she never thought she would: purpose, strength, and a family. The road ahead would be difficult, but Claire knew she wasn't alone. They would face whatever challenges came their way, and together, they would fight for the future they deserved. The storm had passed, but the dawn of a new world was just beginning to rise. The aftermath of the battle left Claire feeling both drained and strangely liberated. The sounds of clashing steel, the bloodshed, and the chaotic cries of the enemy forces slowly faded into silence. Victory had come, but at a price. As the dust settled and the last of the enemies retreated, the full weight of what they had accomplished began to sink in. Claire stood amidst the destruction, her body trembling from the intense battle. She felt the sting of fatigue in her muscles, but there was something else, something more profound. The world had changed. She had changed, and the people she stood beside, the Vampire King and Prince Kale, were no longer just figures of power and mystery. They were her family now, bound together by shared struggles and a common future. The Vampire King approached her, his expression as solemn as ever, but there was something softer in his eyes, something that spoke of gratitude. "You fought well," he said, his voice low and steady, filled with a quiet pride. Claire nodded, her heart swelling. "I didn't do it alone," she replied, her voice filled with sincerity. "We're in this together." The Vampire King's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned his attention to his son, who had already started giving orders to their soldiers. Prince Kale, though still recovering from the effects of the curse, was standing tall. His presence radiated strength and determination. Claire could see the man he was becoming, the leader he had always been meant to be. "It's over," Prince Kale said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. His eyes scanned the field, the destruction, and the bodies of their fallen enemies. "But it's not the end. Not yet." The Vampire King nodded, his gaze sharpening. "The battle was won, but there are still many more to come. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of the threat we face." Claire felt a chill run down her spine at his words. She had known this wasn't the end. There was more to come, more enemies, more darkness waiting to rise. But she couldn't turn away. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease settling in her chest. The Vampire King turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "Now, we prepare for what's coming," he said, his tone grave. "The world won't be the same. We will need to gather our allies, strengthen our defenses, and prepare for the storms that are sure to follow." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Claire knew he was right. The world they had known was shifting, and they were standing on the edge of something much darker. But she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. They had won today, and they could win again. Prince Kale's voice broke through her thoughts as he turned toward her, his expression fierce, yet full of purpose. "We can't let them win," he said, his voice firm. "We have to keep moving forward." Claire nodded, her determination solidifying. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived at the castle. She had discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. She had found her place in this world, and no matter what came next, she would stand by their side. The days following the battle were filled with preparations. The Vampire King and Prince Kael worked tirelessly, sending messages to their allies, gathering intelligence, and fortifying the castle's defenses. Claire was with them every step of the way, learning more about the world she had been thrust into, its politics, its history, and its magic. The more she learned, the more she realized how little she understood. The world of vampires, curses, and dark forces was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. But through it all, she remained steadfast. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for this world, for these people who had become her family. As the days passed, the tension in the castle grew. Their enemies were moving in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Claire could feel it. The storm was coming. And when it hit, they would be ready. One night, as Claire stood on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, the cool night air ruffling her hair, she felt the weight of the moment. Everything had changed. She had changed. No longer just a scared woman running from her past. She had become part of something bigger, a force that could shape the future of this world. "You're thinking too much," came a familiar voice behind her. Claire turned to find Prince Kael standing at the door, his expression soft but still carrying that fierce determination. "You're not alone in this," he added, his voice gentle. "We'll face whatever comes together. I promise." For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire felt a true sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, the challenges still unknown, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't face it alone. With Prince Kael, the Vampire King, and the bond they shared, they would fight whatever darkness tried to take over their world. And together, they would win. The following days were a blur of activity, but they also felt strangely still, as though everyone in the castle knew the calm before the storm was only temporary. The enemy had been defeated in battle, but the Vampire King's warnings echoed in Claire's mind. There was no true peace yet. The fight was far from over. Prince Kael had grown stronger, his body regaining its vitality with each passing day. He was no longer the weakened prince trapped by a curse, but a leader in his own right. His presence commanded respect, and even the Vampire King, usually a solitary figure, began to work with him more closely. They were a team now, but the shadows that lingered outside the castle walls were never far from Claire's thoughts. Late one evening, as Claire sat by the window in her room, the wind howling outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that danger was drawing near. The Vampire King had been quiet for days, lost in his thoughts, likely planning their next move. The night was still, save for the occasional sounds of the guards patrolling the perimeter of the castle. Claire was on edge, her mind racing through everything she had learned since being thrust into this strange new world. Magic, ancient curses, and creatures far older than humanity. She had never imagined such things existed. Yet here she was, bound to this world, tied to these people who had become her family. There was no going back. As if on cue, the door to her room creaked open, and she turned to see Prince Kael standing in the doorway. His expression was serious, his amber eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Claire's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" she asked, rising to her feet. Prince Kael stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "We've received word," he said, his voice tight with tension. "The enemy has regrouped. They're not done with us." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had known it was coming, but hearing it confirmed made the reality of their situation hit her all over again. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Prince Kael sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "We can't stay here much longer. They know where we are. They'll come for us again, and this time, they won't make the same mistake of underestimating us." Claire nodded, her thoughts racing. She had never signed up for this kind of life, but she was here now, and she couldn't back out. Not when so much was at stake. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice stronger now. Prince Kael's eyes softened slightly. "Stay close," he said, stepping toward her. "There's power in your connection to the curse. We can use it to our advantage. But I need you to trust me." Claire swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I do trust you," she said, her voice unwavering. Prince Kael gave her a small, approving nod before turning toward the window. "We'll need to be ready," he said quietly, his gaze distant. They'll come for us when we least expect it. Claire joined him by the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. The night was dark, the moon casting long shadows over the castle grounds. There was something unsettling about the quiet. Something that made her feel like they were just waiting for the inevitable to happen. "We'll be ready," she said softly, her voice filled with determination. Prince Kale turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it felt as if the world outside had faded away, and it was just the two of them. "Together," he said, his voice firm but filled with something else, something deeper. "We will face this together." The bond between them had grown stronger over the past weeks, a silent understanding that spoke volumes. They were no longer just allies. They were something more. Claire felt a sense of calm wash over her, knowing that she wouldn't be facing whatever came next alone. The Vampire King had his plans, and together, they would follow through with them. But Claire knew that the battle they were preparing for wouldn't be the same as the last one. The enemies they faced now were more cunning, more powerful. They would have to rely on every ounce of strength they had left. The next few days were filled with preparations. The Vampire King had already begun to strengthen their defenses, reaching out to their allies and reinforcing the castle's walls. Claire helped in whatever way she could, training with the soldiers, learning the ways of their magic, and discovering more about the ancient curse that had bound Prince Kale. But as the days passed, the tension in the air grew unbearable. Everyone knew that the enemy was preparing for another strike. It was only a matter of time. One evening, as the sun began to set, Claire found herself in the castle's war room with Prince Kale and the Vampire King. Maps were spread across the table, soldiers gathered in the corners, and the weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. The Vampire King stood at the head of the table, his voice steady as he outlined their plan. "We will meet them head-on," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But we will not fight blindly. We will use their own tactics against them. They believe they can break us. We will prove them wrong." Claire listened intently, her heart racing as she realized how much was at stake. The fight was no longer just for survival. It was for the future of the world itself. As the meeting concluded, the Vampire King turned to Claire. "Stay close," he said, his voice gentle but filled with a sense of urgency. "This battle will not be won by force alone. We will need every advantage." Claire nodded, her heart resolute. She wasn't going anywhere. She had found a family here, a purpose, and she would fight for it, no matter the cost. The night before the battle, the castle was eerily silent. The preparations had been made, the plans set, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in her chest. She sat by the window of her room, gazing out at the darkened landscape, the moon casting long shadows over the courtyard. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of danger. She knew the enemy was close, their forces steadily marching toward the castle. The Vampire King had been uncharacteristically quiet in the last few hours, his focus on the final preparations. She had seen him earlier, standing alone in the war room, his eyes narrowed as he studied the map before him. There was no hint of uncertainty in his expression, only cold, calculated resolve. Prince Kale, on the other hand, had been pacing the halls, his frustration palpable. He was ready for the fight, eager to prove himself and protect the people he cared about. But Claire saw the weight in his eyes, the fear of losing control, of losing everything he had fought for. They had come so far, and now, everything was on the line. Claire stood and walked toward the door, her fingers brushing the cool stone as she passed. She had no more answers than she had hours ago, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stay in her room, waiting for the storm to come. She had to be with them. She had to face this battle, whatever it brought, with the people who had become her family. She found Prince Kale in the courtyard, his back to her as he stared into the distance, the weight of the world heavy on his shoulders. The sight of him, strong yet vulnerable, stirred something inside her, a mixture of affection and admiration that she could no longer deny. She walked toward him, her footsteps light against the stone. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression softening just a little. "I thought you were still inside," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and relief. "Couldn't stay in there," Claire replied, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt. "We're about to face a war, and I'm not going to hide from it." Kale's eyes searched hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something. Trust, perhaps. He nodded, his gaze softening. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. Claire stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked out over the castle grounds. The night was still, too still, and the tension was almost unbearable. "What happens if we don't win?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Cale's gaze never wavered from the horizon. "We will win," he said firmly. "We have to. For everyone who's counting on us." Claire didn't know if he was trying to convince her or himself, but she nodded, squeezing his hand. "Together," she whispered, echoing his earlier words. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with something deeper than just resolve, something that made her feel like they had already won, even before the battle began. The Vampire King's voice cut through the stillness of the night, calling them back to the war room. The moment of quiet between Claire and Cale was over. The time for waiting was done. They had no choice but to face what was coming. They made their way back to the castle's center, where the final preparations were being made. The war room was filled with the sounds of hurried footsteps and tense conversations as the final strategies were discussed. The Vampire King stood at the front, his commanding presence filling the room. He turned to them as they entered, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "We've been preparing for this moment," he said, his voice low and steady. "The enemy is close, and they'll stop at nothing to take what they believe is theirs. But we have an advantage. They underestimate us. They think we're weak. We'll show them how wrong they are." Claire nodded, her heart racing as she took her place among the others. She wasn't sure what role she was supposed to play in this fight, but she knew one thing. She was part of this. She was part of their world now, and she would fight for it. The Vampire King turned to Prince Cale, his expression unreadable. "You are ready," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You've come a long way, and this is your moment to lead." Cale straightened, his jaw set with determination. "I'm ready," he said firmly. "Let's end this." The final preparations were made. The soldiers were stationed, the defenses were secured, and the air in the castle grew thick with anticipation. Claire could feel it, an energy in the air, as if the very walls were holding their breath. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The battle was coming, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. She had to be ready. The Vampire King walked to the center of the room, his eyes meeting Claire's one last time before he turned to his son. "Remember," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unspoken weight. "We fight for the future. Not just ours, but for everyone's." Claire stood tall, her resolve hardening. The time for waiting was over. The enemy was here, and they would face it together. The battle had raged for hours, the castle shaken to its very foundation by the ferocity of the conflict. But as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the enemy forces started to falter. Their numbers, once overwhelming, now seemed smaller, their resolve weakening as the Vampire King and his allies fought with unyielding determination. Claire stood at the heart of the battlefield, her sword heavy in her hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had never imagined she would be here, fighting for her life, alongside these powerful beings, but there was no turning back now. Prince Cale was beside her, his movements fluid and precise as he struck down one enemy after another, his strength and confidence growing with every moment. The Vampire King, ever the pillar of strength, moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, his blade cutting through the air with deadly grace. And yet, even as the enemies fell, Claire could feel it, the weight of the moment. The battle was not yet over. The enemy leader had retreated into the shadows, and Claire knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. "We end this now," Prince Cale said, his voice low but filled with an intensity that matched the urgency of the moment. He turned to Claire, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "Are you ready?" Claire nodded, her heart pounding. She had fought alongside them this far, and there was no way she was going to stop now. The future they were fighting for was too important. "Together," she whispered, gripping her sword tighter. The Vampire King, sensing the moment had come, motioned for them to follow. "We must finish what we started," he said, his voice resolute. "This will be the final test. The fate of our world depends on it." The three of them moved through the chaos, cutting their way toward the enemy's last stronghold. The closer they got, the more Claire felt the presence of dark magic swirling in the air. It was thick, suffocating, and she knew they were walking straight into the heart of the storm. As they entered the enemy's stronghold, the temperature seemed to drop. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the flickering torches seemed to barely hold back the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. At the center of the room stood the enemy leader, his dark eyes glowing with malevolent energy. "You think you've won?" he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "You've only delayed the inevitable." The vampire king stepped forward, his posture unwavering. "It's over," he said calmly. "Your reign ends tonight." The enemy leader laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed off the stone walls. "You are fools," he hissed, raising his hands as dark energy crackled around him. "You cannot stop what is already in motion. The curse will return, and your world will fall." Claire felt a surge of power rising within her. She had felt it before, that strange connection to the curse, but now it was stronger than ever. It pulsed within her, a force that she could no longer ignore. She glanced at Prince Kael, whose eyes had also lit up with a fierce determination. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "We will stop it. Together." With that, the final battle began. The enemy leader unleashed his magic, a torrent of dark energy that surged toward them with terrifying speed. But the vampire king was ready. He raised his sword, deflecting the attack with ease, his power a shield that protected them all. Prince Kael joined him, his blade cutting through the dark magic, his movements a blur of precision. And Claire, her heart racing with the raw energy inside her, followed their lead. She raised her sword, a flash of light cutting through the darkness as she struck at the enemy leader. The battle was fierce, but with every strike, the darkness began to wane. The enemy leader's power faltered, his control over the curse weakening as the trio's combined strength overpowered him. Finally, with one final, decisive strike, the vampire king's sword pierced the enemy leader's heart. The dark magic exploded in a burst of light, and for a moment, Claire thought the world itself might shatter. But as the light faded, the enemy leader was gone, his power vanquished. The curse that had bound Prince Kael for so long had been broken, and with it, the shadow that had loomed over their world. The battlefield grew quiet, the only sound the heavy breathing of those who had fought. The vampire king turned to his son, his face unreadable for a moment, before it softened with pride. "It is finished," he said, his voice a whisper. Prince Kael stood tall, his chest rising and falling with the exertion of the battle, but there was a sense of peace in his eyes now. "We've won," he said quietly, almost to himself. Claire looked around, taking in the destruction that surrounded them, but she knew, deep down, that this was the beginning of something new. The war was over, but their world was forever changed. The vampire king turned to Claire, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You've done more than I ever expected," he said, his voice low but filled with gratitude. Claire shook her head, feeling the weight of everything they had accomplished together. "We've all done this," she said, her voice steady. Together, the three of them stood in the silence of the aftermath, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Claire felt a sense of hope. The world they had fought for was theirs to shape, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. And with that, they walked out of the darkness, into the light of a new dawn.